He had been ill for a long time, but it was not the horrors of life in penal servitude, not the work, not the food, not his shaven head, nor his ragged clothing that had worn him down. And what cared he about all those sufferings and tortures? On the contrary, he had been positively glad of the work. Having physically exhausted himself by it, he was at least able to obtain for himself a few hours' peaceful sleep. And of what importance was the food to him, that watery skchi with cockroaches in it? In his previous life as a student, he had frequently not even had that. His clothing kept him warm and was well adapted to the way of life he led. As for the fetters on his legs, he didn't even feel them. Ought he to be ashamed of his shaven head and grey and brown jacket? Ashamed in front of whom? In front of Sonia? Sonia who feared him, and he was to be ashamed in front of her? Yet who would have believed it? He was indeed thoroughly ashamed in front of Sonia, whom in return he had tormented by his scornful and crudely insulting behaviour. But it was not his shaven head or his fetters that he was ashamed of. His pride had been violently wounded. It was wounded pride that had made him fall ill. Oh, how happy he would have been if he could have heaped blame upon himself. Then he'd have been able to endure anything, even shame and disgrace. But he was his own severest judge, and his embittered conscience could find no particularly dreadful guilt in his past, except perhaps for a simple blunder, which might have happened to anyone. What really made him ashamed was that he, Raskolnikov, had gone to his doom so blindly, hopelessly, in deaf and dumb stupidity, following the edict of blind fate, and must submit and resign himself to the nonsense of a similar edict if he were ever to know any rest. An anxiety with no object or purpose, in the present, and in the future nothing but endless sacrifice, by means of which he would attain nothing, that was what his days on earth held in store for him. And what of the fact that in 8 years' time he'd only be 32, and be able to resume his life again? What good was life to him? What prospects did he have? What did he have to strive for? Was he to live merely in order to exist? But 1,000 times before he'd been ready to give up his existence for an idea, for a hope, even for an imagining. Existence on its own had never been enough for him. He had always wanted more than that. Perhaps it had been merely the strength of his own desires that made him believe he was a person to whom more was allowed than others. And even if fate had sent him no more than remorse, burning remorse that destroyed the heart, driving away sleep, the kind of remorse to escape whose fearsome torments the mind clutches at the noose and the well, oh, how glad he would have been. Torment and tears, after all, that is life too. But he felt no remorse for his crime. At the very least, he would have been able to feel anger at his stupidity, just as he had felt earlier anger at the stupid and outrageous actions that had brought him to the prison. But now, in prison, in freedom, he had once again considered and gone over all the things he had done, and had found them to be not nearly as stupid and outrageous as they had seemed to him earlier, during that fateful time. In what way, he thought, in what way was my idea any more stupid than the other ideas and theories that have swarmed in conflict with one another ever since this world was born? All one needs to do is take a broad, entirely independent view of the matter, a view that is shorn of ordinary prejudices, and then my idea will not seem half so strange. Oh, gainsayers and 5-kopeck sages, why do you stop halfway? After all, why does what I did seem so outrageous to them? He said to himself. Because it was an act of wickedness? But what do they mean, those words, an act of wickedness? My conscience is easy. Of course, from a legal point of view, a crime was committed. Of course, the letter of the law was violated, and blood was spilt. Well then, here's my head. Take it in exchange for the letter of the law. Let that be that. No, of course, in that case a great many of mankind's benefactors, who did not inherit power but took it for themselves, ought to have been executed at their very first steps. But those people had the courage of their convictions, and so they were right, while I didn't, and consequently had no right to take the step I did. This was the one respect in which he admitted to any crime, in not having had the courage of his convictions, and in having turned himself in. He also suffered from the thought of why he had not killed himself that day. Why had he stood gazing down at the river and decided that he would prefer to turn himself in? Did this desire for life really have such power? Was it really so hard to overcome it? Svidrigailov had overcome it, had he not, he who was so afraid of death? He kept tormenting himself with this question, was unable to grasp that even that day, as he had stood looking down at the river, he had quite possibly sensed in himself and in his convictions a profound lie. He did not understand that this sense might have been the harbinger of the future crisis in his life, of his future recovery, his new vision of life. He preferred to admit only to a certain blunting of his instincts, something he had been unable to break with or step across out of weakness, personal insignificance. He looked at his companions in penal servitude and marvelled how much all they, too, loved life, how they treasured it. It seemed to him that in prison it was loved and valued and treasured more than in freedom. What terrible sufferings and tortures some of them had endured, the vagrants, for example. Was it really possible that there could be such significance for them in a mere ray of sunlight, a dense forest, a cold spring somewhere in the mysterious depths of the woods, noticed some 3 years ago, and of the rendezvous which the vagrant dreamed as of a tryst with his beloved, seeing it in his dreams, the green grass around it, a bird singing in a bush. Observing further, he saw examples even more unfathomable. In the prison, in the environment that surrounded him, there was, of course, much that he did not observe, did not at all wish to observe. It was as if he lived with his eyes forever lowered. What there was to see he found loathsome and unendurable. Eventually, however, many things began to fill him with wonder, and almost in spite of himself, he began to observe things that before he had not suspected. His most general and inescapable wonder was, however, occasioned by the terrible and impassable abyss that lay between himself and all these people. He and they seemed to belong to quite different nations. He and they viewed one another with suspicion and hostility. He knew and understood the general causes of this separation, but never before had he believed it possible that those causes could be so deep-rooted and powerful. In the prison there were also some exiled Poles, political criminals. They simply viewed all these people as ignoramuses and peasants, and looked down on them from above. But Raskolnikov was unable to do the same. He clearly perceived that these ignoramuses were, in many respects, more intelligent than those very Poles. There were also Russians who thoroughly despised the common prisoners, one former officer and 2 seminarists. Raskolnikov clearly observed their error too. As for himself, all the other convicts disliked him and avoided him. Eventually they even grew to hate him. Why? He could not find the answer. He was despised and laughed at for his crime by men who had done far worse things than he. "You're a toff," they'd say to him. "What business did you have going around with an axe? That's not the sort of thing toffs do." In the second week of Lent, his turn arrived so fast, and to attend Holy Communion, together with the other men from his barrack. He entered the church and prayed together with the others. On one occasion, he himself did not know the reason, there was a quarrel. All the men attacked him in a frenzy of rage. "You're an unbeliever! You don't believe in God!" they shouted at him. "We ought to kill you!" Never once had he mentioned the subject of God and faith in their company. Yet they wanted to kill him as an unbeliever. He said nothing and did not try to protest. One of the convicts prepared to hurl himself at him in a state of rabid fury. Raskolnikov awaited his attack in silent calm. He did not turn a hair, not a single feature of his face quivered. The guard managed to interpose himself between him and his would-be murderer. If he had not done so, blood would have been spilled. There was one more question that remained unsolved by him. Why had they all taken such a liking to Sonia? She had not tried to ingratiate herself with them. They encountered her seldom, only sometimes they were at their work when she had come out to them for a moment in order to see him. Yet all of them knew her, knew that she had followed him, knew how and where she lived. It was not as if she had given them money or performed any special services for them. Only on one occasion, at Christmas, had she brought alms for every man in the prison, pies and kolaches. Little by little, however, they came to be on rather closer terms with Sonia. She'd write letters for them to their families and post the letters at the post office. Their kinsfolk, male and female, who visited the town would leave, according to their instructions, items of personal use and even money for them, which they entrusted to Sonia's hands. Their wives and girlfriends knew her and would go to visit her. And when she appeared at their workplace in order to see Raskolnikov, or met a gang of convicts going to work, they'd all take off their caps, and all would greet her, "Little mother, Sofya Semyonovna, you're our mother, our kind, soft-hearted one," they'd say, those branded convicts, to that small, thin creature. She would smile and greet them back, and they all loved it when she smiled at them. They were even fond of her manner of walking, and would turn round to look after her as she went on her way, passing appreciative comments about her. They often made such comments in connection with her being so small, and indeed could not find enough good things to say about her. They went to see her if they were ill, and she would tend to them. He remained in hospital throughout all the end of Lent and Holy Week. As he got better, he remembered the dreams he had had as he lay there in fever and delirium. In his illness, he had dreamt that the entire world had fallen victim to some strange, unheard of, and unprecedented plague that was spreading from the depths of Asia into Europe. Everyone was to perish, apart from a chosen few, a very few. Some new kind of trichinae had appeared, microscopic creatures that lodged themselves in people's bodies. But these creatures were spirits, gifted with will and intelligence. People who absorbed them into their systems instantly became rabid and insane, but never had people considered themselves so intelligent and in unswerving possession of the truth as did those who became infected. Never had they believed so unswervingly in the correctness of their judgments, their scientific deductions, their moral convictions and beliefs. Entire centres of population, entire cities and people became smitten and went bad. All were in a state of anxiety, and no one could understand anyone else. Each person thought that he alone possessed the truth, and suffered agony as he looked at the others, beating his breast, weeping, wringing his hands. No one knew who to make the subject of judgment, or how to go about it. No one could agree about what should be considered evil and what good. No one knew who to blame or who to acquit. People killed one another in a kind of senseless anger. Whole armies were ranged against one another, but no sooner had these armies been mobilized than they suddenly began to tear themselves apart, and their soldiers hurling themselves at one another, gashing and stabbing, biting and eating one another. All day in the cities the alarm was sounded. Everyone was being summoned together, but who was calling them, and for what reason no one knew. But all were in a state of anxiety. They abandoned the most common trades because each person wanted to offer his ideas, his improvements, and no agreement could be reached. Agriculture came to a halt. In this place and that, people would gather into groups, agree on something together, swear to stick together, but would instantly begin doing something completely different from what had been proposed, start blaming one another, fighting and murdering. Fires began. A famine broke out. Everyone and everything perished. The plague grew worse, spreading further and further. Only a few people in the whole world managed to escape. They were the pure and chosen, who had been predestined to begin a new species of mankind and usher in a new life, to renew the earth and render it pure. But no one had seen these people anywhere. No one had heard their words or voices. Raskolnikov was tormented by the fact that this senseless delirium should linger so sadly and so agonizingly in his memories, that the aftermath of those fevered dreams should be taking so long to clear. They were already in the second week after Holy Week. The days were warm, clear, and spring-like. The windows of the convicts' ward had been opened. They were covered by an iron grille, and a sentry patrolled the ground beneath them. Throughout the whole duration of his illness, Sonia had been able to visit him in the ward only twice. Each time she had had to obtain permission, and this had been difficult. But she had often come into the courtyard of the hospital and stood under the windows, especially towards evening, and sometimes in order merely to stand in the yard for a moment and look at the windows of the ward from afar. One afternoon, towards evening, the now almost completely recovered Raskolnikov fell asleep. On waking up, he chanced to go over to the window and suddenly saw in the distance, by the hospital gate, Sonia. She was standing there, looking as though she were waiting for something. In that moment, something seemed to transfix his heart. He shuddered and quickly drew away from the window. On the following day, Sonia did not come, nor did she the day after. He noticed that he was waiting for her with anxious concern. At last he was discharged. Arriving back at the prison, he discovered from the convicts that Sofya Semyonovna had fallen ill and was lying in bed in her quarters, unable to go anywhere. He was very concerned, and sent someone over to find out how she was. Soon he found out that her illness was not a dangerous one, and having learned in her turn that he was so dejected and worried for her sake, Sonia sent him a note written in pencil, informing him that she was much better, and that soon, very soon, she would come and see him at his work again. As he read this note, his heart beat violently and painfully. It was another clear, warm day. Early that morning, at about 6 o'clock, he set off for his work on the bank of the river, where a kiln for the baking of alabaster had been set up in a shed, and where they pounded it. Only 3 men had been sent there to work. One of the convicts went off with the guard to the fortress for some implement or other. The other man began to chop firewood and put it in the kiln. Raskolnikov went out of the shed, right down to the bank, sat down on the logs that were piled near the shed, and began to look out over the wide, lonely river. From the high river bank, a broad panorama opened out. From the far-off opposite bank he could just make out the sound of someone singing. Over there, in the boundless steppe, awash with sunlight, he could see the yurts of the nomad tribesmen, like barely perceptible black dots. Over there was freedom. Over there lived other people, quite different from those who lived here. Over there time itself seemed to have stopped, as though the days of Abraham and his flocks had never passed. Raskolnikov sat gazing, motionless, without cease. His thoughts moved away into dreams, into contemplation. He had not a thought in his head, but a sense of weariness disturbed him and tormented him. All of a sudden Sonia was next to him. She had made her approach almost inaudibly and had sat down beside him. It was still very early. The chill of the morning had not yet relented. She was wearing her old threadbare burnous cape and her green shawl. Her face still bore the signs of her illness. It had grown thin and pale and sunken. She gave him a pleased, friendly smile, but, following her habit, extended her hand to him timidly. This was the way she had always proffered her hand to him, timidly, sometimes not even proffering it at all, even though she were afraid that she would refuse it. He had invariably taken her hand with a kind of revulsion, invariably greeted her with something akin to annoyance, on occasion remaining stubbornly silent throughout the entire duration of her visit. Sometimes she had feared him and had gone away in deep sorrow, but now their hands were not disjoined. He gave her a quick, fleeting glance, uttered no word, and lowered his gaze to the ground. They were alone. No one could see them. At this moment the guard had his back turned. How it came to pass he himself did not know, but suddenly it was as though something had snatched at him, and he was hurled to her feet. He wept and hugged her knees. In that first split second she was afraid, and her whole face froze. She leapt up from where she was sitting and stared at him, trembling. But immediately, in that same instant, she understood everything. Her eyes began to shine with an infinite happiness. She had understood, and now she was in no doubt that he loved her infinitely, and that at last it had arrived, that moment. They began to speak, but were unable to. There were tears in their eyes. Both of them looked pale and thin, but in these ill-pale faces there now gleamed the dawn of a renewed future, a complete recovery to a new life. What had revived them was love, the heart of the one containing an infinite source of life for the heart of the other. They determined to wait and endure. There were still 7 years to go. And until that time was over, how much unendurable torment and how much infinite happiness they would experience. But he had recovered, and he knew it, felt it completely, with the whole of his renewed being, while she, after all, lived only in his life. That same evening, when the barracks had been locked for the night, Raskolnikov lay on the plank bed, thinking about her. Throughout that day he had even felt that all the convicts, his former enemies, now looked upon him differently. He had actually begun to talk to them, and they had replied to him in kindly tones. Now this came back to him. But after all, this was the only way it could be. Surely everything now must change. He thought about her. He recalled the way he had constantly tormented her, preying upon her emotions of her heart. He remembered her pale, thin little face, but now these memories caused him hardly any pain. He was aware of the infinite love with which he would make up for those sufferings now. In any case, what were they, all those torments of the past? All of them. The whole thing, even his crime, even his sentence and exile, now seemed to him, on this first impulse, now seemed to him something alien and external, as though none of it had ever happened to him. He was, however, unable to give much prolonged or continuous thought to anything that evening, or to concentrate on any one idea, and anyway, even if he had been able to, he would not have found his way to a solution of these questions in a conscious manner. Now he could only feel. In place of dialectics, life had arrived, and in his consciousness something of a wholly different nature must now work towards fruition. Under his pillow there was a copy of the New Testament. Mechanically he took it out. This book was hers, was the same one from which she had read to him of the raising of Lazarus. At the outset of his penal servitude, he had thought that she would torment him with religion, talk about the New Testament, press books on him. Much to his great surprise, however, she never once even offered him a New Testament. He himself had asked for it, not long before he had fallen ill, and she had brought him her copy in silence. Until now he had never opened it. Even now he did not open it, but a certain thought flickered through his mind. What if her convictions can now be mine too? Her feelings, her strivings, at least. All that day she too had been in a state of excitement, and at night even suffered a return of her illness. So happy was she, however, so unexpectedly happy, that her happiness almost made her afraid. 7 years. Only 7 years. At certain moments During the initial period of their happiness, they both viewed those 7 years as if they had been 7 days. He did not even know yet that his new life had not been given him gratis, that he'd have to purchase it dearly, pay for it by a great heroic deed that still lay in the future. But at this point, a new story begins. The story of a man's gradual renewal, his gradual rebirth, his gradual transition from one world to another, of his growing acquaintance with a new, hitherto completely unknown reality. This might constitute the theme of a new narrative. Our present narrative is, however, at an end.